Hello, and welcome to our presentation on derivatives in the airline industry. My name's Ethan, and I'll be the moderator of this discussion today. And together, our four presenters will cover the topics of the use of derivatives in the airline industry and how their use has impacted the profitability of airline companies during the COVID-19 pandemic. At the end of the presentation, I'll conduct a brief Q&A where each of our presenters will get the opportunity to answer some questions that the audience may want us to discuss. Our presentation will have a focus on New Zealand's biggest airline, Air New Zealand. Many of our arguments will be supported by information and data about Air New Zealand. Airline companies are exposed to a great amount of risk, so in this presentation we'll discuss how derivatives are used to manage this risk. We'll also discuss how the closed borders and a huge drop in demand for air travel due to the pandemic has impacted the profitability of airline companies. First up, we have Tu Phuong, who will take us through the use of derivatives in the airline industry.
So, Air New Zealand is faced with two main types of risk: fuel price and foreign currency. In order to manage this risk, Air New Zealand uses hedging, which is using the financial instruments to manage the exposure of the risk of the underlying assets. And also, Air New Zealand managed to not using financial instruments for speculative purposes.
Regarding fuel price risk, so the source of risk comes from the fluctuations in the fuel price, and Air New Zealand objective is to mitigate these risks and achieve certain stability and certainty in the fuel expenses. So they use fuel swap and options to hedge these exposure. In a fuel swap, Air New Zealand will enter into a contract with the counterparty with agreed price, quantity, and future delivery date. On future delivery date, the fixed price will be compared with the spot price. If the spot price is higher than the fixed price, then the counterparty will pay Air New Zealand the difference, and this difference will be used to offset the fuel expenses for Air New Zealand. And if the spot price is smaller than the fixed price, then Air New Zealand will have to pay the counterparty the difference. As a result, Air New Zealand will lock in a predetermined fuel price and protect it from the fluctuating fuel price. Air New Zealand used the collar strategy with their options, so they long the call options with a strike price K2, and they short the put option with a strike price K1, where K1 is smaller than K2. And when the spot price is smaller than K1, then the put options will be exercised. Then Air New Zealand will have to buy fuel at K1. And when the spot price is larger than K2, then Air New Zealand can exercise the call options and buy the fuel price as K2. But when the spot price is between K1 and K2, then no options is exercised and Air New Zealand just buy the fuel at the spot price. So in either scenarios, Air New Zealand can always lock the fuel price between the range K1 and K2, which is predetermined.
So now we're moving on to actions during COVID-19. With the decline in air travel, as you can see on this graph, there is definitely the decline in fuel consumption, and Air New Zealand realized that they actually overhedge in their positions. So what they need to do is that they need to reduce their open hedging positions accordingly. So this is a table of their hedging positions I've combined from several years during COVID-19. And during this period, their hedging positions is actually only 1/3 of their period before COVID. However, in 2023, with the borders reopening again, Air New Zealand is planned to change their hedging strategy accordingly to satisfy the new demand.
Thanks for that. Now Liu Guan will discuss some different kinds of risks that airline companies are exposed to and how the use of derivatives can mitigate them.
New Zealand faces the currency risk due to the advanced unstable need change rates normally trading activities during the currency borrowing and the pressure on the sales will leading to the foreign currency exchange risk. Only in case of the large number of experienced capital transportation in the short term, aid of foreign currency would be carried out. Operation cash inflows in foreign currency are mainly in Australian dollars, European euros, Japanese yen, Chinese yuan, British pounds, and US dollars. Foreign currency operation cash outflows are mainly in US dollars. Therefore, it's necessary to hedge it. During the competitive of coronavirus-19 on global travel, its hedge was cancelled for financial year 2020 on 6th March 2020. They only use the cross foreign currency interest rate swap to hedge the Australia dollars. This group invests in overseas business and is to use the borrowed relevant foreign currency to hedge it. With the reduction of the situation, Air New Zealand overseas business has gradually recovered and it has resumed hedged the foreign currency like the US dollars, Japanese yen, and euros. Show as the table compared with the 2021, the number of hedged foreign currency in 2022 would increase. The Air New Zealand used the true finance way to hedge this foreign currency for its cash flow hedge. They will use the cross foreign currency interest rate swaps. So they will have agreements and the swap provider, like the bank or finance company, will give New Zealand interest payment to protect New Zealand is not influenced by the exchange risk. The secondly is net investment hedge is used company.
Next, Yoshi will talk to us about how the use of derivatives has improved the profitability of airline companies during the COVID-19 pandemic.
To begin with, let me show you crude oil price shift during the pandemic. 2020 was a terrible year for fuel hedging. Travel demand plunged at the same time as oil prices. However, as the economy emerges from the pandemic, crude oil prices surged to two-year high. These fluctuations made it very difficult to hedge their fuel costs. Usually, airline companies use fuel swap or car strategies, as mentioned before, but in 2020, they had derivative contracts for which there was no corresponding purchase of jet fuel, making the hedge ineffective under the rule. So their accounts were cruelly exposed when Brent crude prices plunged, resulting in millions of dollars of losses for European airlines. Stung by the experience, airlines decided to overhaul their hedging program. So what they do is shorten the term of derivative contracts or rely more heavily on call options instead of forward contracts or swaps, for example. So let's have a look at two cases in more detail. So first one is Air France. Air France successfully decreased hedging exposure by changing the term of derivative contracts and also reduced the maximum volume of hedged portfolio. So the newfound cautiousness in the hedging strategy make it more suitable for the airline. Another case is about Air New Zealand. After realizing significant amount of loss in 2020, the company had restructured its hedging policy by incorporating a higher proportion of options contracts and thereby limiting losses if prices fall. So the benefit of this strategy is that the risk of increased fuel prices was mitigated to some extent. It also allows full participation in downward pricing movement as well.
Now Kanishka will discuss how the use of derivatives has hurt the profitability of airline companies during the pandemic.
How using derivatives during COVID-19 has hurt the profitability of airline industry. As mentioned by my peers before, fuel expense is a major cost for airlines, and that cost fluctuation has a great effect on airlines' operating cost. To top this risk is fluctuation in foreign currency prices, which airline has to deal with. COVID-19 crisis has disrupted global travel and resulted in dramatic decrease in consumption of jet fuel by airlines. Coupled with this decline was a deep and rapid decline in oil prices. As a result, airlines that had currency hedging agreements prior to pandemic were negatively impacted by large fluctuations in exchange rate. This has resulted in heavy losses for some airlines. One example of an airline that has been adversely affected by currency hedging during pandemic is Air Canada. In 2020, losses on foreign exchange amounted to 293 million compared to gains on foreign exchange of 499 million in 2019. The losses on foreign exchange in 2020 included losses on foreign currency derivatives of $583 million and foreign exchange gains on long-term debt and lease liabilities of $346 million. Here's a case for Air New Zealand, how fuel derivatives have hurt their profitability. The company said it would feel the impact of 85 to 105 million fuel hedging redesignation, aircraft impairment charges of 350 million to 450 million, and reorganization cost of up to 160 million in the full financial year. Higher fuel and labor costs on top of few flights due to pandemic restrictions have led Air New Zealand more than doubling its loss in the financial year. That was largely driven by fuel cost rising from 311 million to 560 million and labor cost up from 830 to 976 million. This fuel cost drove the fuel hedging losses that Air New Zealand suffered. In conclusion, Air New Zealand effectively utilized derivatives to manage various risks and optimize financial outcomes. This includes hedging fuel prices through fuel swaps and options, using a collar strategy to stabilize expenses within a predetermined range. The company also engages in hedging foreign currency risks through cross-currency interest rate swaps and strategically invests in overseas businesses. Moreover, during the challenging times of COVID-19, Air New Zealand adjusts its hedging strategy according to new situations, ensuring resilience and adaptability in the face of uncertainty. Impact of using derivatives. The use of derivatives has a significant impact on Air New Zealand's ability to improve profitability during the pandemic. By utilizing derivatives, the company is able to decrease its hedging exposure and limit potential losses in downward price movement. This enables Air New Zealand to effectively manage market volatility and safeguard its financial performance. Through the strategic implementation of derivatives, the company can optimize its risk management strategies, protect its profitability, and navigate through challenging market conditions more effectively. However, using derivatives has disadvantages as well. The decrease in profitability during the pandemic was primarily influenced by the impact of fluctuating exchange rates, which can significantly affect the profitability of airlines. Additionally, some airlines, including Air New Zealand, faced heavy initial losses due to over-hedging their fuel jet prices and fuel purchases with forward and future contracts.
And that concludes our presentation on the use of derivatives and different hedging strategies airline companies use, and how these strategies have impacted their profitability over recent years. But I thought it would be good to ask our presenters some questions that the audience have come up. Here's the first question. I see that the hedging strategy does not always generate positive returns. For example, in the collar strategy, if the spot price is smaller than the strike price of the put option, Air New Zealand will have to pay the higher price than the market price and let its call options expire at the same time. So why would they still want to implement the strategy?
Thank you so much for your question. So, Air New Zealand does not use financial instruments with the objective of generate positive returns. Instead, it uses the financial instruments to stabilize the fuel expenses. So yes, there are scenarios where the hedging strategy can cause negative returns.
So we have a question that Liu Guan can answer. Does currency risk, only denominated in Australian dollars, need to be hedged using cross-currency interest rate swaps?
I think they would use those cross swap to hedge all the foreign currency, but due to the coronavirus 19 on the global traveling, they only use this way to hedge Australia dollars at the beginning in the 2020, but after that, at the 2021 and 2022, we will also use this way to hedge other foreign currencies.
Question for Yoshi. What was the implication of implementing the new hedging policy for international airlines?
Their revised policies were designed to give greater flexibility and to reduce the negative impact of the hedge rule when there's a significant unexpected drop in demand or sudden drop in fuel prices.
And a final question for Kanishka. In your opinion, which derivative position hurt airline companies the most during the pandemic?
I think the fuel derivatives have hurt the airlines the most due to the fact that how drastic the fall in demand for fuel was, and thus the price of jet fuel greatly declined as well. Airlines had to pay much higher prices for fuel later on when things got a bit much more stable, and the fuel price that they had to pay was much more higher than they were expecting, and therefore they incurred huge losses.
Thanks presenters, and thanks audience for tuning in.